In our previous lecture, we began to explore the question of early Christian persecution and martyrdom through the martyrdom of Polycarp, one of the writings of the Apostolic Fathers. The word martyr actually comes from a Greek word, martyros, which means witness. Martyrs were those who were the ultimate witnesses to their faith. The tradition of Christian martyrs had precedent among Jews, some of whom, in the course of their history, were executed for their refusal to abandon the ways of the Torah. The most graphic instance that we have from our historical record is in a book called Second Maccabees. This is a book which deals with the Maccabean revolt. The Maccabean revolt took place about 160 years before Jesus. It was a revolt of the Jewish people in the land of Israel against their Syrian overlords. The king of Syria was a man named Antiochus Epiphanes, who decided that he wanted to Hellenize all of his territory, including the Jewish territory, which meant that he wanted Jews in Israel to give up their Jewishness and become Greek in culture. Antiochus Epiphanes, his real name is Antiochus. It's Antiochus the Fourth. Epiphanes is his nickname, which means Antiochus, manifestation of God, as he called himself. Antiochus Epiphanes deemed that Jews could no longer follow their religion, and so he made following the Jewish religion illegal. And in the Maccabean revolt, then, we have a revolt of Jews against their Syrian overlord Antiochus in order to establish Israel as a sovereign state in the land. It was a revolt that ended up succeeding, and they drove out the Syrians and did establish Israel as a sovereign state. This is some 160 years before Jesus. There's an account of the wars that took place under the Maccabees, which is the name of the family that led the revolt, in two books called First and Second Maccabees, which are found in the Protestant Apocrypha. These are deuterocanonical books in the Roman Catholic and Orthodox canons of Scripture. Second Maccabees is particularly interesting for our purposes for this lecture because Second Maccabees shows the Jewish precedent for Christian martyrdoms. Second Maccabees contains several very gripping and graphic accounts of Jews who were martyred under Antiochus Epiphanes because they refused to recant their Judaism. In particular, we're told of an old man named Eleazar, who is brought before Antiochus Epiphanes and ordered to eat pork. In fact, they try to force pork down his throat so that he will violate the Jewish law against eating pork. And he refuses to eat the pork and spits it out, and calls Antiochus a tyrant, and then is executed on the spot for doing so. More graphic is the account of the martyrdoms of 7 brothers and their mother, who are all left unnamed, but all of whom refused to eat pork. They refused to give in on their religious commitment found in the Torah. In this case, the commitment to the kosher food laws of the Jews. And we have an account then of Antiochus ordering their execution, and it's a very graphic, detailed account. He murders these brothers one at a time, making the mother watch on, and then murders the mother. The first brother has his tongue cut out, his hands and feet cut off, and then, while still living, he's placed in a pan over a live fire and roasted to death. That was the first. The others were watching this, and they were being forced to watch this as a means of getting them to decide this wasn't what they wanted to go through themselves, but they all remained faithful, and one at a time they're executed until finally the mother herself is executed, all of them for deciding to remain faithful to the Torah of God. This is happening 160 years before Jesus, and so obviously well before any Christian martyrdoms. The martyrologies of the Christians, the accounts of the Christian martyrdoms, and so, to some extent, are based on these Jewish accounts of martyrdoms in a different time and a different place. I should say that that under the Roman Empire, as opposed to the Syrian Empire, under the Roman Empire, Jews by and large were exempt from persecution. We'll see later in this lecture that Christians are persecuted precisely because they refuse to worship the state gods of the Romans. Jews also refused to worship the state gods of the Romans. Romans, though, did not persecute Jews for being Jews. Unlike Antiochus Epiphanes, the Syrian monarch, the Roman emperors allowed Jews to retain their Jewishness. They did not persecute Jews for not worshiping the state gods, because in Roman thinking, the Jews had an ancient religion. And since they had an ancient religion, it was okay for them to follow their religion because Romans respected antiquity above all else when it came to matters religious. Christians, of course, could not claim antiquity for their own religion because Jesus was a figure who lived just 100 years earlier. And so they didn't have an ancient religion, they had a recent religion, and so they were not exempt from worshiping the state gods, as we'll see. Christians were sometimes persecuted unofficially through such things as social ostracism or rejection from their families from the very beginning days of Christianity. There were a number of instances of unofficial persecution, but in this lecture we are interested principally in official persecution of Christians by administrators of the Roman state. That, of course, is how Jesus himself died by order of Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, and it's how Ignatius and Polycarp both died, on the basis of official proclamation by administrators of the Roman state. This leads, though, to a number of interesting questions that we need to address. On what grounds exactly were Christians persecuted? How widespread was the persecution? Are thousands and thousands being murdered, executed, martyred all around the empire? How did Christians react to their persecution? These are some of the questions we'll be addressing in this lecture. In the lecture, we'll be considering instances of official persecutions of Christians under three different Roman emperors. Emperor Nero, who reigned from AD 54 to 68, Emperor Trajan, who reigned from 98 to 117, and Marcus Aurelius, who reigned from AD 161 through 180. I should point out, these are the three official persecutions of Christians that we know about from the first 2 centuries. It's a mistake to think that Christians were persecuted by all emperors everywhere. In fact, persecutions were a sporadic affair that occurred locally for the most part. We don't have any evidence at all of any empire-wide persecution of Christians until the year 250. In the first and second centuries, the persecutions were localized affairs and they're very sporadic. We know of only 3 instances that were officially sanctioned by Roman emperors. First, the persecution in Rome under the Emperor Nero. This is the first instance we have of an official stand taken against Christians by a Roman emperor. Prior to Nero, Christianity appears to have been far too insignificant for much notice to have been taken of it. This comes as a shock to many of my students at Chapel Hill when I inform them that Christianity was so insignificant in the Roman Empire in the first century that, in fact, in no Roman author of the first century is Christianity ever mentioned at all. Jesus is never mentioned by any Roman writer of the first century. Jesus isn't mentioned at all by a Roman writer until the year 112, in the writing of an author we're going to be considering in a moment, Pliny the Younger. Christianity simply didn't make a huge impact on the Roman world looking at it from a Roman perspective. Nero, in the year 64, did persecute the Christians. So Christians were known to Nero, but we don't learn about Nero's persecution from a first century source. We don't learn about it until the 2nd century. Nero's persecution was a very localized affair. It was not an empire-wide persecution. It was a persecution of Christians who happened to live in the city of Rome. Our only extensive account of Nero's persecution of the Christians comes in the writings of the Roman historian Tacitus, who in the year 115 published his book, The Annals of Rome, which was a history of the Roman Republic and Empire. Tacitus, in one portion of his Annals, indicates that the Emperor Nero, in the year 64, had arranged for parts of Rome to be burned by arson. He wanted Rome to be burned, apparently, according to Tacitus. Nero wanted Rome to be burned because he had some architectural designs for the city, and he couldn't very well implement his architectural designs while there was already architecture standing. And so he wanted parts of the city destroyed, and evidently, at least according to Tacitus, he arranged for the major fire that took place in the year 64. A good portion of the city of Rome was burned to the ground, leaving, of course, many thousands of people homeless. This led, of course, to a very dissatisfied population. And some people came to suspect that Nero himself was actually the culprit behind the fire. Nero then needed to take the blame off himself, and so he wanted to shift the blame to someone else, and he chose the Christians as scapegoats. According to Tacitus, he chose the Christians because of the Christians' hatred of mankind. In other words, Christians were known to be antisocial beings who were not well liked and who themselves did not appreciate other people. They were not popular among the populace. And so it was quite easy for Nero to blame the Christians for the fire, to say that the Christians started the fire. Some historians have actually argued that Nero was right. The Christians started the fire, that some Christians wanted to have Rome burned because of their opposition to Rome, or perhaps because of their apocalyptic vision that the end of the world was soon to come and to kind of initiate the apocalypse. I think that's probably going beyond the evidence. Tacitus at least thinks that Nero himself started the fire and simply used the Christians as the scapegoats. Nero rounded up Christians in Rome, and he subjected them to horrible punishments, terrible tortures, and death. Tacitus tells us that he had some of these Christians rolled in pitch and then set aflame to light his gardens, and he had others wrapped in the skins of animals, and he set wild dogs upon them as a public spectacle. So there is widespread torture and death under this persecution of Nero. There are several features of Nero's persecution of Christians in the year 64 that make it distinctive. The important thing to point out is that, technically speaking, Christians during this persecution were not actually being persecuted for being Christian. They were persecuted for committing arson. Now, the charge, at least according to Tacitus, was false, but that was the charge. In other words, they're not being put on trial for claiming to be Christian. They're being put on trial for setting fire to Rome. So the second point that's important to note is that this was a persecution that was localized, limited to the city of Rome itself. There's no evidence that any of the governors of any of the provinces outside of Rome took note of this and thereby went out and started persecuting the Christians. Because, again, this wasn't a declaration that Christianity was illegal or not permitted. It was simply a way of Nero passing the blame off of himself onto Christians for the fire in Rome. Nonetheless, many historians think that Nero's treatment of the Christians set a kind of precedent for later emperors who, for reasons of their own, wanted to oppose Christians. The reasons other emperors and other officials wanted to oppose Christians, as we'll see, is because Christians refused to worship the state gods. Christians refused to worship the state gods, and because of this, they were persecuted because the ancient Romans understood that it was the state gods that made the state great. Refusing to worship the gods meant making a political statement that you were opposed to Rome, the state that the gods had made great. Ancient people didn't differentiate between the religious realm and the political realm the way modern people do. Religion and politics were closely intertwined, so much so that it's difficult actually to find an ancient Greek or Latin word that means what we mean by the term religion. Religion was implicated in all sorts of aspects of a person's life, including politics. The gods made the state great. The gods are part of the state, and the state worshiped the gods as part of the state apparatus. Worshipping the gods was part of the political agenda. Since the gods made the state great, people need to worship the gods. The next state-sponsored persecution that we learn about comes some 50 years after Nero. So there's not a constant persecution by emperors, it's periodic. 50 years later, under the Emperor Trajan. We know of the incident of persecution under Trajan. Again, it's a localized affair that's localized to the region of Bithynia, which is in western Asia Minor. It'd be what is now western Turkey. There was a governor of Bithynia whose name was Pliny. He's known to history as Pliny the Younger. He's called Pliny the Younger because he had an uncle who's known to history as Pliny the Elder. His uncle was very famous. His uncle was a natural scientist who wrote a number of books about science. He was a very curious man, interested in natural phenomena, Pliny the Elder. In fact, when Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, Pliny the Elder was so intrigued by volcanic eruptions that he wanted to go investigate. And so he went to investigate the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and he actually got too close. And that was the end of Pliny the Elder. His nephew, Pliny the Younger, was watching the eruption of Vesuvius from far away and actually took notes on what was happening. Later in his life, Pliny the Younger became a Roman governor, an administrator who was appointed to be the governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor. We are in a unique situation with Pliny the Younger because Pliny wrote a number of letters to the Roman emperor about affairs going on in his province, and these letters survive. So they provide us a first-hand account of Roman affairs in one of the Roman provinces in the early 2nd century. One of these letters mentions a certain set of problems that was happening in Bithynia that Pliny wanted some advice about. There was a problem in Bithynia because there was a local law that forbade the gathering together of social groups. Now, apparently this law had been instigated because the provincial authorities were afraid of some kind of political uprising against the Romans. And so they forbid all public meetings, all social gatherings. This solved the problem. People couldn't get together in order to plot a rebellion because people couldn't get together. And so to that extent, I suppose it was a successful law, but it led to problems. It led to one problem in particular that you might not think of, which was that without the possibility of social gatherings, there was no possibility of fire brigades. Which meant, as it turned out, there were villages where fires were started, and there was no fire brigade, and so they couldn't put out the fire, and so entire towns were being burned up. And so Pliny writes a letter to the emperor Trajan. This is about the year 112, where he discusses some of these problems that he's having with meetings of people, social gatherings, which he mentions these problem with the fire brigades. But he also mentions that there are some groups that are meeting in secret, and these groups are a problem because there's one group in particular that's meeting together, a group of Christians. These Christians gather together before it's dark, he says, and they partake food together, although they eat normal food, so there's no problem with that. But and then they worship Christ as if a god. And they sing hymns to Christ as if a god. This is the reference that I intimated earlier when I said that the first time Jesus is ever mentioned in a Roman source comes in the year 112. This is the reference. where Pliny says that these Christians were worshiping Christ as a god. That's all he says about Jesus. He doesn't say anything else, but it's our first Roman reference to Jesus. Pliny decides that he needs to crack down on this Christian group, and he's writing Trajan to tell him what his modus operandi is in dealing with the Christians. Because he knows the Christians are not to be allowed to engage in their distinctive worship. He doesn't tell us how he knows that. We don't know exactly what the situation is because we are pretty sure there is no law against being Christian, but there appears to be, by the time of Pliny, at least a custom or a tradition that Christians are to be forced to recant their faith and not to be allowed to continue to be Christian. What Pliny's procedure is that if somebody is accused of being a Christian, he brings the person forward and he brings out a statue of the emperor, a bust of the emperor, and he requires the person to offer incense to the emperor as an act of sacrifice, to acknowledge that the emperor, the Caesar, is his master, the Caesar is his lord. If a person willingly makes a sacrifice to this image of the emperor, then Pliny lets him off the hook. If the person will not perform the sacrifice, Pliny knows that they're a Christian, and so he has them executed. He asks Trajan whether this is the proper political, the proper way to proceed or not. And Trajan replies that in fact this is entirely acceptable. So Trajan writes a letter back and he says this is perfectly acceptable, but he says, he specifies, Christians are not to be hunted out, only if they're brought forward by accusation, and anonymous accusations are not to be accepted. So somebody has to fess up that they're the ones who are accusing so-and-so of being a Christian. And if somebody's being accused of a Christian, then the person's to be called into court and asked to make a sacrifice, and if they make the sacrifice, fine, let them go. If they don't make the sacrifice, they're to be executed. Now, this might sound a little bit harsh, simply executing somebody for claiming to be a Christian. The logic behind Pliny's procedure is quite clear. Christians alone refuse to offer a sacrifice to a pagan deity. Any polytheist would have no trouble at all making a sacrifice to the emperor. I should stress that this needs to be put in the context of Roman religions generally. As I've indicated in an earlier lecture, Romans were polytheists who believed in many gods. And in the Roman provinces, at least, not in Rome itself, but in the Roman provinces, the emperor himself was treated as a deity. There was an entire emperor cult. In other words, a worship of the emperor spread throughout the provinces, especially in the East, especially in Asia Minor. I need to stress that it's not that the Romans or the other inhabitants of the provinces thought that the emperor was the one true God. It's not that he's God and there's no other. It's not that the emperor is Zeus, for example, or one of the mighty gods. He's just one of the divine beings. Of course he's a divine being. Look at how much power he has. He can't be merely mortal. He's a divine being. And so they would worship the emperor as as a lower level divine being. The only ones who refused this worship, of course, are the Christians, except for the Jews, whom I've already mentioned. Jews, though, are off the hook because they have ancestral traditions. Christians will not worship the emperor as a divine being because they don't believe in divine beings except for the one God. And they refuse to subject themselves to the lordship of anybody except Jesus Christ himself, who's the Son of that one God. And so if somebody doesn't offer a sacrifice, it's obvious that person's a Christian, and so they get executed. But why execute these people? Well, it's clear that Pliny himself is not the one going out trying to find these people, and Trajan tells him, don't go out hunting for Christians. Well, then who's causing the persecution? Again, it's just the mobs. It's the local people. It starts at the grassroots level as local people are turning Christians in. Why are they turning Christians in? Probably this is related to Roman religion. Within Roman religion is believed that if the gods are not properly cared for, if you don't engage in the worship of the gods can act out their vengeance by causing harm to people, by bringing famine, by bringing flood, by bringing economic disaster, by bringing military defeat. If there's an earthquake or there's a famine or any other problem, then why is this happening? The gods are doing it to us. Why are the gods doing it to us? Because they're angry. Why are they angry? Because they're not being worshipped. Well, who's not worshiping them? The Christians. So the Christians are at fault for the disasters that are happening. There's an interesting passage in the writings of Tertullian. Tertullian is a early 3rd century church father who wrote a defense of Christianity against its intellectual despisers. And he has this very well-known passage in which he explains why it is that Christians are hated by everybody. He says that people hate the Christians because they think the Christians are the cause of every public calamity and every misfortune. If the river Tiber rises up as high as the city walls, if the Nile does not rise to the fields, if the weather will not change, or if there's an earthquake, a famine, a plague, straightway the cry is heard out, toss the Christians to the lion. So Christians being persecuted whenever there's a disaster. So from this exchange between Pliny and Trajan, we learn that becoming a Christian is not actually a crime. Remaining a Christian is a crime. If you give up being a Christian, if you recant being a Christian by offering sacrifice, you can be let off the hook. They're being executed probably by Pliny because of the local populace that are fearful of the gods. But the elite people like Pliny and Trajan probably don't buy this fear of the gods business. Otherwise, they would hunt out the Christians. The fact they don't hunt them out shows probably that the educated elite had a different view of the relationship of the gods to humans. Finally, the third instance of a state-sponsored persecution happened about 50 years later still, under the philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius. We learn about the persecution under Marcus Aurelius not from a Roman source, but from an eyewitness account of the martyrs of Lyon and Vienne in Gaul, modern-day France. The account is preserved for us in the writings of the 4th century church father Eusebius, who quotes a letter that was written by the survivors of this persecution in Lyon and Vienne in Gaul. This was a letter written by the survivors to another church in which they detail what happened during this persecution. It's gory and graphic in its description of the torture and execution of men and women who were Christian that otherwise we don't know about, apart from this letter, including a Christian leader named Saturnus and a woman named Blandina. It's quite clear from this account that it was the pagan mobs who were out for blood, and the pagan administrators simply satisfied the mob's desires. The tortures are described, especially the tortures of Blandina, who goes through many days of torture and is so tortured by these professionals that they end up not knowing what else to do to her because they can't get her to recant. And this shows that the point of the tortures wasn't to punish the Christians so much as it was to get them to stop being Christian, because they want the Christians to worship the state gods. Blandina and Saturnus and the others refused to recant, even subjected to having hot plates attached to their body, red hot plates, and being thrown to wild beasts, and being, just all sorts of things happening to them where their bodies are being taken apart. They refused to recant, just as the Jewish martyrs refused to recant in the book of 2 Maccabees. We are told, though, that on occasion these torments were successful. According to this letter from Lyon and Vienne, there were Christians who caved in when faced with torture and recanted being Christian. Let me wrap up this lecture by making some concluding remarks. Persecutions during the first 2 centuries A.D. were generally popularly motivated rather than officially motivated. They were the result, for the most part, of mob violence, starting from the ground up. They didn't originate from the top down. They were, as a result, highly sporadic. They were not consistently applied. You didn't have persecutions happening all the time. These persecutions were not based on Roman law per se. Technically speaking, Christianity was not illegal. Christians were punished not for having or practicing an illegal religion, but for being troublemakers, and especially for their refusal to worship the state gods, and their recalcitrance, their obstinance in refusing the state gods showed the Romans that they in fact were troublemakers. Fear of the gods is no doubt what ultimately drove pagans to persecute the Christians. These persecutions, in other words, as odd as it may seem, these persecutions were religious acts by Romans who took real interest in their own religion and who were sincerely offended by the religious views of the Christians.